Great. Oh, okay. Everybody, and thank you for coming along to this workshop. Thank you, Noika, for the introduction as well. So as she said, I'm Kiran, I'm from the DBS, and I'm part of a new department that we have there, which is about our outreach work that we do. So there's a few regions within the country where there's one of me. So that includes London, Greater London, and essentially I'm a point of contact for any inquiries or questions that people may have with regards to DBS, and that can include the different levels of DBS checks or something to do with questions about barring. So I think there's a lot to the DBS that people assume that we're just the ones that do the police checks and or they think that they need the highest level of check when actually they might just need the basics. So any sort of inquiries and questions I can support anyone with, but I've got the workshop anyway now. So I'm just gonna share my screen. So just to let you know that I will be turning my camera off and then I'll be presenting. But if anyone has any questions, by all means, please feel free to just not shout, basically shout at me, it's okay. Because sometimes I can't always see the handout, but you know, feel free to just let me know. Obviously, you know, we are talking about safeguarding and safer recruitment here. So if anybody has anything they would like to share, that's absolutely fine. But just to bear in mind, confidentiality across the board, basically, and whatever we discuss here just kind of stays here, if that's okay. Right, so if that, I'll start the presentation then. So hopefully all will work well. Okay, can you all see that? Okay, brilliant. Okay, right, hopefully that should all work okay. So yeah, so yes, thank you again everybody for coming along to this DBS overview workshop. So we're just going to be talking about the different services that the DBS offers and how these services can be used within safer recruitment, and how they can help to protect the vulnerable adults and children that we're working with day in, day out, and how these services can support yourselves and your organisations to keep those vulnerable adults and children safe within our community. So, oops, hopefully things are working. Oh, not sure what's happening. Sorry, I'm just having a bit of a technical thing here. There you go, right. So, right, so the aims and objectives of the workshop. So hopefully by the end of this workshop, you'll have a good understanding, hopefully, of the different levels of DBS checks and their eligibility. So we'll be talking about those 4 different levels and what they all mean. We're going to look at the information that is filtered from a DBS certificate. So the information that is removed before it appears on the certificate, which is what an employer or the individuals who's making that suitability decision will be making, what information they are viewing on that DBS certificate. We're going to have a look at what regulated activity is. So this is a very key term that you'll hear a lot about, especially when we're talking about the enhanced level of check with the barred list. So that will make sense when we speak about that. And obviously regulated activity is a very specific type of activity, and we will be looking at what that is. We're going to have a look at talk about the DBS update service as well. And that is our online subscription service, and how that can benefit you within your organisation when it comes to safer recruitment and keeping on track of an individual, and if there's any kind of updates to their DBS certificate, and how that can help you there. We're also going to talk a little bit about barring as well, which I'll obviously cover in a little bit more detail, but there's and the different ways people can make a barring referral, as well as looking at when a barring referral should be made and who can make a barring referral, and essentially what makes a good barring referral. So hopefully that is what everyone was hoping to talk about today. So that should give you a good idea and a good overview about the DBS and our services. But just to start off with, basically, just a bit about the DBS. I mean, the DBS is about protecting the public by helping employers make safer recruitment decisions, and by barring those individuals who pose a risk to vulnerable groups from working in certain roles. so essentially, by allowing individuals, employers, sorry, to review and have a look at an individual's past criminal convictions and cautions, that employer can then use that information to make an informed decision about whether that person is suitable for the role that they've applied for. And obviously, where they are, if a concern ever arose where there was the potential for harm, or harm has occurred, the individual has posed the harm to a vulnerable adult or child that was within their care, then that individual could be considered for barring. And if they are considered for barring and it's found that they shouldn't be working with that particular group, then they could be placed on a barred list. So we have two barred lists. We have the children's barred list and the adults barred list, and some people may appear on both. So, and by using these services and these methods, and that's how we are contributing to the safeguarding environment and making sure that the correct people are in the roles that they should be in, basically. Last year, we released our DBS strategy. So that kind of details our key ambitions for the next 5 years. And that focuses on our profile, our quality, and our people. So we want to be seen as a visible, trusted, and influential organisation who provides an outstanding quality of service to all our customers and partners. And, you know, we would count yourselves here today and CBS, obviously, you know, as our partner, and, you know, hope to work closely with you all and make sure that if there's any concerns that you have with regards to the DBS, that, you know, we're there to support you through that. But also, if you had any feedback for us in terms of DBS and its services, then that's something that we should, you know, that it's always good for us to learn about and continue the development of our services and make sure that we are fit for purpose in that respect. So thinking specifically about the role of the DBS, the DBS is responsible for the delivery of disclosure and barring functions on behalf of the UK government. So we operate their disclosure functions for England, Wales, the Isle of Man and the Channel Islands, and that's all under Part 5 of the Police Act of 1997. And this is supported by the active legislation that you can see here on this slide. So the legislation sets out certain things such as the levels of DBS checks that are available, what types of information are disclosed on the different levels of check, and the eligibility criteria that has to be met for an individual to be eligible to apply for those levels of DBS checks. So we also operate barring functions for England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and that's under the Safeguarding Vulnerable Groups Act of 2006, as well as the Northern Ireland Order of 2007 and the Protection of Freedoms Act 2012. And again, they also set out the processes and procedures that have to be followed, as well as the criteria that has to be met for us to be able to legally bar an individual. And that's basically our reasoning basically for existing almost, is this legislation that supports us and the work that we do. So in terms, to give you a little idea of how many applications we get, the last financial year, obviously from March 2020 to March 2021 this year, we issued 3.5 million standard and enhanced disclosures that year. So over 90% of those were actually enhanced checks. So these are our third highest level of check, and around 22% were for volunteer positions. So strangely, or, you know, something that's quite interesting is that more than 90% of those applications actually contain no information. So it just shows you that the amount of applications that are coming in and that obviously are flowing straight out with no information, but that small percentage of applications that are coming in where there is vital information that needs to be disclosed, you know, that information should then be, you know, used along with other safer recruitment policies, such as, you know, recruitment of ex-offenders, safeguarding policies, training protocols, you know, other safer recruitment practices should be used along with that DBS information, and the employer should make an informed decision about the suitability of that individual. We have 1.5 million people subscribed to our update service, and again I will talk to you a little bit later about that. As I mentioned, it's our online subscription service, and we also processed around about 1.85 million basic disclosures per year. So basic disclosures are our most basic level of check. There's no eligibility for this level of check. Anybody could apply, put in an application for a basic DBS check, and that can be done on our government websites, although we do have umbrella bodies as well that can also be used for that. But essentially, you know, anybody who wanted a basic level of check could get one quite quickly. And in terms of our barred list, our most recent facts there have shown us that we have 81,000 people who are barred from working with children and or adults. So that's obviously quite very long list, and we make sure that our processes and our checks are of the highest level, so that those checks are carried out as thoroughly as we can, basically, that technology allows us to, which is obviously of a high standard, but just shows you like there's a lot of people there that shouldn't be working in regulated activity, and that's why it's important that these checks are carried out. So just in terms of where we fit in terms of the safeguarding environment, just got like a little a diagram here. So we've got the people that we care for, those vulnerable adults and those children that we care for in the center of our community, in the center of our environment, in a sense. And outside of those, we've got all the teachers, the social workers, the healthcare professionals, the GPs, the youth workers, our voluntary organizations, everybody who has that direct contact with those individuals in the center of our safeguard environment. They're the ones who are proactively providing a service. Outside of them, we have those organizations that are those larger organizations that will indirectly have contact with those vulnerable adults and children. You know, they're the ones that normally that the people who have direct contact with are perhaps representing and are working with. And outside of those, we have those larger organizations that will regulate and monitor the services and support that is going in and feed good practice through as well. And the DBS, Disclosure and Borrowing Service, is part of that outer regulatory circle, basically. And, you know, and that's where we fit in to make sure that the right processes and procedures are used with safer recruitment, so that the people who are directly working with our vulnerable adults and children are the right ones to do so. So we're going to start with disclosure. So as I mentioned again, disclosure is where an employer or a recruiter is allowed access to view an individual's past criminal history and convictions, and they use that information to make a decision as to whether this person is suitable for the role that they've applied for. So DBS checks are a very important part of any recruitment process, but are only one part of the whole when it comes to safer recruitment practices. So of course, it all starts with our top circle, which is about getting the right level of checks at the right time. So to do this is always a good idea to have a clear and comprehensive job description. And this will help you and the applicant understand what level of DBS check is allowed. This then allows you as an employer to seek out the right amount of information from the applicant's history that might affect their job performance and potential risks if they are working with vulnerable groups. So even before a DBS check is requested, it's important to obviously check ID documents and the right to work, and look at their employment history and take references to get a full picture of that individual as possible. The next step is to be prepared when you receive a certificate with information on it. Even if it's a rare occurrence, it is important to consider how that information relates to the role and your policies. So depending on what is included in the certificate information, as an employer, you should know what measures should be in place in order for that applicant to be employed. So one way to be prepared is to have a recruitment of ex-offenders policy in place, and that sets out how you would consider offences that potentially could be disclosed on a DBS certificate. And obviously it doesn't end once the person is in post. The employer should have the right processes and procedures in place then to ensure that they can recognise and act on harmful behaviour if they see it. So having processes in place will make it safer and easier for employees to also disclose information that's essential. So whistleblowing policies, training, reporting procedures, these are all kind of protocols and policies that can be used to help employers and other fellow employees to understand when it is best to report any concerns that they may see. And obviously keeping accurate records is also very, very important when it comes to taking necessary and appropriate action to remove risks of future harm. So when somebody is in regulated activity, it's important that they are removed from the role if there are serious concerns about or evidence of harm or the risk of future harm. So, and being prepared to do so and being able to document and record that and justify those reasonings as well is all very important. And then finally, if there are serious concerns, you should seriously consider whether you should make a referral to the DBS, especially if someone's been removed from regulated activity because they've harmed or they've posed a harm or risk to a vulnerable adult or child. Then there may even be a legal duty to do this as well. But we are going to talk about that a little bit later as well. So the 4 different levels of DBS checks to consider. So we have the basic, the standard, the enhanced, and the enhanced with barred list check. So the basic check is £23, and as I mentioned earlier, there is no eligibility for this level of check and anyone can apply for it. So what you see on this certificate is any unspent convictions and conditional cautions. So just a little bit about that actually before I continue. Obviously, if an individual has a conviction and they've served their time or their sentence for it, the time that comes after that conviction is called the rehabilitation time. So if an individual, whilst they're in the rehabilitation period, has applied for other jobs and roles, those convictions will be considered to be unspent because they are still within their rehabilitation period. Once they've left their rehabilitation period, those convictions are considered spent. So you'll hear those words a little bit more here now as well. So as we were saying, so the basic check basically would just disclose any unspent convictions. So where an individual has a conviction and they're still within that rehabilitation period, if they apply for a role, that role will be disclosed at that time. The standard check is also £23 and it includes spent and unspent convictions and cautions, and that's subject to filtering as well, which we'll talk about in a bit. The eligibility for standard checks is outlined in legislation, and you can find out more about that on the DBS website and our workforce guides that the DBS have written. But with the standard check, they are very specific roles. For example, there'll be like roles that involved within the financial industry, or a veterinary surgeon, or the veterinary industry, football stewards. It's very specific as to the type of role which is eligible for a standard DBS check, and again that's all on legislation or within our workforce guides that we have. So the enhanced check is £40 and it includes everything that's on the standard check, but now this also includes relevant police intelligence. So that application will be sent to the police, and relevant police forces will have a look at their own records, and if there is any information that they have, they will then contribute that then as well. So this could be things that haven't necessarily led to a caution or conviction, but that a chief police officer may think is relevant to the role or the workforce that's being worked with them. And that's why that's pretty key for that particular level of check. And then the enhanced with barred list check is also £40. And that includes everything that's on the enhanced check, but also has access to the children's and or the adults barred list too, so that you can see if someone is barred from working within those groups. The standard enhanced and enhanced with barred list check are free for volunteers, but because the basic is eligible for everybody, there is a charge for volunteers for a basic check too. And just let you know that obviously with the enhanced with barred list check as well, that particular level of check is usually for those roles that is considered regulated activity. And, those we'll be looking at that in a little bit more detail in a bit. So one thing we're asked about quite often by organisation in terms of information that's been disclosed is if an individual receives a conviction or police information becomes available after a certificate has been issued, how as an organisation and an employer would they ever find out about that information? And that's what the DBS update service is there to provide. So the DBS update service is free for volunteers, and for paid positions it costs £13 a year for an applicant to be able to register their DBS certificate online. So this allows regular checks to be carried out on the certificate to make sure that the information on it is still valid and still up to date since the date the certificate was issued. So it helps you as an organisation to support your safeguarding measures because it allows you, the employer, to check online free of charge, and as long as it's with the individual's consent, you can check that the DBS certificate that somebody's showing you is still valid and it's still up to date. So the certificate has to be at a level that you are able to check and for the correct workforce. So for example, if you're recruiting for an individual to carry out work with children, and for that role they require an enhanced DBS with a children's barred list check, if the applicant tells you that they already have a check at that level and is registered with the DBS update service, so rather than having to apply for a brand new DBS application, the employer can just jump online and using the individual's login details and of course their consent, they can check and see if the certificate that they have in front of them is still up to date and valid. And they can do that then without having to apply for a brand new one, and obviously taking in the timescales for that as well. So as an organisation, when you do make the check online, you're advised of a number of different things depending on the information that's on the certificate and whether it's still up to date. So the employer could be told that no new information exists, which means that since the certificate has been sent out, no new information has become available and that the certificate is still valid and up to date. meaning that the employer can still accept it, and they know that no new information exists, in which case the certificate I have in front of me is still valid and we're good to go in a sense. The update service can also let you know if the original certificate contained no relevant information. So that's the intelligence from the police that they believe was relevant when the certificate was applied for. So if there's nothing further to add there, it will tell you that as well. Conversely, it may also tell you that new information does exist. Which means that since the certificate was issued, new information has become available, but it won't tell you exactly what that new information is. Instead, it will just alert you that new information exists, and the employer, it'll be good practice for the employer then to let the individual know that new information exists on your DBS certificate, and talk about it, and then obviously apply for a new DBS check, basically. And finally, the fourth option is that you could be told that there's no record of the certificate in the DBS update service, and that means either the employee has given you the wrong login details, or it might mean that their DBS update subscription is no longer active as well. So those are your possible update statuses, basically, that you could receive as an employer checking on the update service. So as an employer, the main benefit of the DBS update service is that it allows you to recheck when you need to, and as long as you have the individual's consent, you can check to see that the certificate is still valid and up to date. And obviously it allows you to check as frequently as you need to. Some organizations obviously have like specific time scales when they will resubmit an application for a DBS. For example, a lot of organizations will submit a new application every 3 years. You know, the update service does end up being cheaper than submitting an application every 3 years, but obviously it allows them, you can check obviously whenever you need to, and it's obviously a lot quicker as well. So yeah, so there's much faster results as for the organization if their employees are registered with the update service. And also just let you know that as well, that some individuals may have worked with various groups and therefore have various levels of DBS checks. So you only need one subscription basically to be able to subscribe all those different certificates to the system. If you do decide, if an employee does decide they want to join the update service, they have to do it within 28 days of receiving their standard or enhanced with barred list check. So there is a bit of a timescale for that. So the DBS update service, it checks new information from the police national computer, and it checks the barred list on a weekly basis, and it checks relevant police information every 9 months. So it's very detailed, and obviously it is regularly updated. And yeah, as an employer, as long as you have your consent of your employee, you can check whenever you need to. So that there is the update service. So a little bit about the filtering rules now that I mentioned. So the filtering rules came into play in 2013 when Supreme Court ruled that disclosing all spent and unspent convictions was in breach of the European Convention on Human Rights. It was then amended again in January 2019, and since then these are the new DBS filtering rules basically. So the rules are that if a conviction that is not on the list of specified offences, so by specified offences we mean those convictions and offences that will never ever be filtered, and that includes all serious offences. So as long as a conviction is not on the specified offences, then if 11 years have gone since the date of the conviction, or 5.5 if the person was under 18 when they were convicted, and as long as that didn't result in any custodial or suspended sentence, then that conviction will be filtered from the certificate and will not be on the certificate when the employer receives it. So it's just important to bear that in mind, that obviously, you know, so yeah, where time has passed, if it's felt that if it didn't result in a custodial or suspended sentence, and obviously it wasn't a conviction that's on the list of specified offences, then these convictions will be filtered off, and the employer will have no idea about it when they see it on the certificate. So a cautions, when it comes to cautions, will be filtered off 6 years since the date of the caution, and again only as long as it doesn't appear on the DBS list of specified offences, that will never be filtered. But it's just important to mention then as well, obviously, that however, although information can be filtered off a DBS certificate, if it's an enhanced check, for example, or enhanced bar list check, and the chief police officer feels that this is important information that should be mentioned because of the relevant workforce, they are still at their discretion and disclosure to be able to mention that and allow that to be in a certificate as well. So the police do still have, they can still involve and include any information that they feel will be relevant to that particular role and the workforce that they're working with. So I hope that's okay there. So thinking about scenarios when, as an employer, you receive someone's DBS check and there's information on it, how should you respond to that disclosure information? So we're just going to have a quick look and think about some of the things that an employer can consider if they ever see information on their on a DBS certificate. So when they receive the DBS certificate, thinking about the information and what it means basically, and it's important that the employer thinks about what that particular information means in relation to the role that the individual is going to be carrying out and the potential risk that could come with that information as well. So on the top of this slide, we have regulated activity. So is that individual barred from working in that workforce? And the reason we have this at the top is because if you're employing someone to work in regulated activity and that person is barred from working in that workforce, it would be a criminal offence for you to allow them to carry out that job role. So if an individual is barred, and it's a criminal offence for them to offer to work, if an individual is barred, it's a criminal offence for them to offer to work or seek to work in regulated activity in the workforce that they are barred from. And it's also a criminal offence for the employer to allow them to work in that workforce too. And that's why it's the first thing to consider in terms of the information that can be disclosed on a DBS certificate. So if the results come, if the certificate comes back and it says this individual is barred from working with children, for example, then essentially that application can go no further. The other things to think about in terms of what's been disclosed on the certificate include, are there any kind of legal or regulatory requirements? So for example, some regulators such as Ofsted and the Care Quality Commission, they have certain requirements in place that outline what information will make an individual unsuitable to carry out certain roles that they regulate. So if someone isn't barred from regulated activity, then it's important to think about, are there any other requirements that might mean that the information disclosed will make that person unsuitable for the role that they are recruiting for? Other things to think about are the age at the time the offence was committed and the seriousness of the offence. So was the applicant particularly young when they were given that conviction, or was it for a particularly minor offence that might not have any relevance to the job role that you are recruiting for as an employer? Other things include, are there any patterns of offending behaviour? So is the information that's been disclosed an indication that the person has a pattern of offending behaviour and has multiple convictions that span over several years? Or is it more of an indication that it might have been a one-off isolated incident? So, as an employer, you can discuss this with the applicant to understand a little bit more about what the situation was at the time that they received the conviction or caution. Other things that can be really useful to discuss with the applicant in terms of information that's been disclosed are what the circumstances were surrounding the offending behaviour that might have led to that person receiving the conviction. So was the individual undergoing periods of extreme hardship or suffering from poor mental health? Were they suffering from drug abuse or substance issues at the time? These circumstances may have led to them receiving a conviction, but they may no longer be relevant in terms of the job role that they're going to carry out. So this is something that, as an employer, again, you can discuss with the applicant. And finally, we have evidence of rehabilitation. So is there any evidence that the individual has changed their ways? Is there any evidence of rehabilitation, such as drug counselling, or evidence of no recent offending on that person's certificate? As well, does the employer have sufficient references from other organisations that might demonstrate that the person has changed their behaviour? So these are all things that an employer can think about when information is disclosed in a certificate, and something that they can also think about when they're carrying out their risk assessments to determine whether that individual is still suitable to carry out the role that they're recruiting for. So as I mentioned before, like a DBS, information on a DBS certificate shouldn't be seen as a pass or fail in a sense. It should be taken in consideration along with other safer recruitment processes, and if need be, speak to the individual and find out a little bit more about what the situation was, and use all that information then to make a decision. And and use that information if need be to also put in carry out risk assessments as well, if and make that judgment based on all the information that they have in front of them. So I hope that's okay there. So we're going to have a quick look at the different, obviously, the different levels of DBS checks available we've had a look at, but trying to determine what level of DBS check you are able to apply for. I'm going to have a little look here now. So, I mean, something, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of people tend to feel that they're like the highest level of checks, in which case they will apply for the enhanced with the barred list check. But if that role isn't eligible for that particular level of check, then it's illegal in a sense for that person to then apply for that role. So just to, and obviously trying to work out the best level of check as well, what the right level of check is, sorry, I should say, you know, it's about thinking about these 5 different elements now. So we're going to be talking about the enhanced DBS check and above in this workshop, but just thinking about the types of things that need to be considered when determining the level of check that employees would be eligible for. So there's 5 things to think about. The first one being who the organisation provides services for. So is the organisation providing services for children or adults or potentially both? The next thing to think about is what the role involves. So what activities is that person going to be carrying out and what they actually get to be responsible for in that job role. So, and these kind of specific activities will come into play in a little while when we talk about regulated activity. The next is thinking about how often it's being performed, how often the activity is being performed or delivered. So for certain levels of DBS checks, it's not just about what activities they're carrying out, but also the need for them to be carrying them out often enough to be eligible for certain levels of DBS checks. So how often they do the activity is also important. Next, it's important to consider if the work is supervised as well. So again, for some levels of DBS checks, if an individual is carrying out a certain activity, but there is somebody else who's responsible for supervising that person as they carry out that activity, this can change the level of DBS check that they might be eligible for. So the employer may decide that the person is being sufficiently supervised, so they don't need the high levels of DBS checks. So supervision can alter what level of DBS check a person is eligible for. And finally, we have where the role is being performed. So in legislation, there are certain scenarios where an individual might not be eligible based on the activities that they're doing, but they could be eligible based on where the role is being performed. And these are called specified establishments, and we'll have a look at that in a little while as well. So as we mentioned, the first thing to consider is who that person will be working with in the course of their employment. So from a DBS perspective, we have 3 different workforces. So you have work with children, which is the child workforce, work with adults, which is the adult workforce, and everything else comes under the other workforce. So we're not really going to be covering the other workforces today, but that would include taxi licensing, security licensing, things that are associated with gambling and the Gambling Commission. And also those who are employed for the purposes of national security and service of the Crown. And these again are all outlined in legislation. So you can always go on our DBS website to find out more about the other workforce in that respect. Sorry, that was it. Right. So we're going to look at firstly the children's workforce. And for DBS purposes, a child is a person who has not yet reached the age of 18. So this table here will help us to decide what activity is technically regulated activity when working with children. And regulated activity is what makes somebody eligible for the enhanced DBS with the children's barred list check. So as we discussed previously, what is the activity? How often is it carried out and is it supervised? So we'll go through this table and break it down a little bit more. So the first example is providing healthcare. Now this can be any type of healthcare that's provided by a healthcare professional or someone acting under their direction or supervision. So anyone that is providing any type of healthcare at all, it only has to be done once for it to be regulated activity. So providing personal care, again, this only has to be carried out once to be regulated activity with children and therefore eligible for the enhanced with children's barred list check. So personal care is obviously where help is provided with eating and drinking because the child is very young, they're ill or they have a disability. It can include things like help with toileting, washing and dressing, again, because of the child's age, illness or disability. So for both these activities, for healthcare and personal care, it only has to occur once for it to be personal regulated activity. So a classic example of those would be doctors and nurses providing healthcare. They are in regulated activity. They would be eligible for an enhanced DBS check with the children's barred list. So next we have the teaching, training and instruction of children and caring for or supervising children. So if this is an unsupervised activity, then it has to happen more than 3 days in a 30-day period or once overnight with the opportunity for contact between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. If those conditions are met, then it's regulated activity and again, eligible for the enhanced DBS with the children's barred list check. The supervision element is quite important here. So if they're supervised, then the employer may judge that the employee is not in regulated activity and in which case they would only be eligible for the enhanced check. But again, it is the employer that has to make that suitability decision here, and because they can understand what kind of supervision is required for that particular circumstances. But if it is unsupervised and it happens more than 3 days in a 30-day period or once overnight between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m., then it is considered to be regulated activity with children. Providing advice or guidance for physical, emotional or educational well-being. Again, this has to happen more than 3 days in a 30-day period or once overnight for it to be regulated activity with children. Driving children under arrangement has to occur more than 3 days in a 30-day period, and it cannot be a personal arrangement between parents, for example, like if it's a school run being swapped by parents as a friendly gesture, that would not be regulated activity in that case. So it's where a professionally agreed arrangement has been made to drive children and it happens more than 3 days in a 30-day period, then it becomes regulated activity. Moderating an online chat room. Again, this has to happen more than 3 days in a 30-day period. The chat room can be mostly or wholly for the purposes of children. If the moderator has access to the content that's being discussed in the chat room and has the opportunity to speak directly to the children in the chat room, then it is regulated activity. It can also be other types of digital contact too. So it could be a helpline or other types of virtual communication. Registering to be a childminder, including voluntary registration, and registering to be a foster carer are both regulated activity. People who are registering would be in regulated activity and eligible for the enhanced DBS with the children's barred list check. Just important to mention here as well that day-to-day managers of people who are in regulated activity. So if someone is doing a particular role, for example, teaching or training and instruction for more than 3 days in a 30-day period, their line manager would also be eligible for the same level of check that they have. So anybody who manages somebody who's in regulated activity, then they are also in regulated activity too. And as a final note, slight difference in rules for those who are aged between 16 and 17 are in employment. So if you have an individual who is teaching or training a child who's between 16 and 17 for an apprenticeship, for example, then they will not be in regulated activity. But if that child then goes on to college to receive training there, then the teacher there would be considered to be in regulated activity. So for 16 and 17-year-olds who are in employment or even voluntary, the situations are a little bit more different there. So I hope that's okay. So the specified establishments that I mentioned earlier, so these allow us to consider whether someone is working somewhere, which means they are in regulated activity with children, even though their actual role isn't, as we saw previously. So this specified establishments are outlined in legislation and can include schools, nurseries, children's homes, children's centres, childcare premises, and detention centres as well. So if somebody is working in one of these premises, but they're not doing any of the activities we saw on the last slide, then they may be in regulated activity if they satisfy the following criteria. So which is if they work there more than 3 days in a 30-day period or overnight between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. and have the opportunity for contact with the children in the establishment while they're there. If they work there for the purpose of the establishment and it's not a temporary or an occasional role or a supervised volunteer role, then that person would be in regulated activity and eligible for the enhanced DBS with the children's barred list check. So classic example of this is a school caretaker. So they're a permanent caretaker in the school 5 days a week. They're at the school premises during the hours that the children are also present, so they have the opportunity for contact. They work there for the purpose of the establishment because they're looking after the school and they're permanent and not temporary or occasional or volunteer, then they would be considered to be in regulated activity because of where they work. And they will be eligible for the enhanced DBS with the children's barred list check. So work with children, which is not regulated activity. So if somebody is not necessarily in regulated activity because of where they work or what they're doing, they may be eligible for a different type of check. And sometimes these checks are not regulated activity, but they're described as old regulated activity. So a few examples here. If somebody is supervised whilst teaching, instructing, caring for, supervising children, they would be eligible for an enhanced DBS check. Again, the supervision element here is really important to think about, because if they're supervised and they are doing one of those activities, then they're only eligible for the enhanced DBS check. So and that includes if they're a supervised volunteer in a school or any other specified establishment, again, they would only be eligible for enhanced DBS check because that supervision element is there. If somebody is living or working in childminding or childcare premises, the individual would also be eligible for an enhanced DBS with a children's barred list check. So this is important if there was a childcare manager, for example, they had a partner who's also living at the same home, then that partner would also be eligible for an enhanced DBS with the children's barred list check as well. And that's because their primary residence is an establishment where regulated activities takes place. So that's why that would be important there. Anyone carrying out regulated activity but not often enough, so where we saw the period conditions on the table previously, if they're not doing often enough, then they would be still eligible for the enhanced DBS check. So for example, if you had a sports coach who was coaching children only twice a month, because they haven't met that 3 days in a 30-day period threshold, they would only be eligible for the enhanced DBS check. And any trustees of children's charities would be eligible for an enhanced DBS check too. So the children's charity has to be mostly, fully or wholly for children, and they would potentially also be carrying out regulated activity with children as well as part of their activities. The trustees of those charities would be eligible for an enhanced DBS check as well. So that's everything about regulated activity for children. Does anyone have any questions about that before we move into, or about anything that we've covered so far before we move into adults? No? Cool, okay. So the adult workforce, again, for DBS purposes, an adult is anybody who is aged 18 or over. So again, we have a table to outline what is considered regulated activity with adults. So what activities does an individual have to be doing to be eligible for enhanced DBS with an adult's barred list check? So the main difference you will notice here between this table and the table for regulated children with activity with children, sorry, is that for working with adults in regulated activity, there is no period condition that has to be met. So they only have to be doing these activities once to be eligible for enhanced DBS with an adult's barred list check. Because carrying out any of these activities once is considered regulated activity with adults. So on the left-hand side here of the table provides a description of what the activity is, and the right-hand side gives a little bit more information about what we mean when we say that activity. So for example, providing healthcare to adults is regulated activity if it's being provided to adults by or under the direction or supervision of a healthcare professional, then it's regulated activity with adults. Similarly, providing personal care to adults is regulated activity if it's concerned with the washing or dressing of those adults, or assisting them with eating, drinking, toileting because of the adult's age, illness, or disability. Providing social work to adults is also regulated activity if it's being provided by a social care worker to an adult who is a client or potential client. Assistance with day-to-day financial running of the adult's own household. So this could include managing the adult's cash, paying their bills, carrying out their shopping. That would be considered regulated activity. But it's important to reiterate at this point, though, that when these types of activities are carried out as part of a personal arrangement, they are not then considered regulated activity. So it can't be just your neighbour doing your shopping for you. That would not be considered regulated activity. To be regulated activity, an individual has to be recruited or employed to carry out that specific activity, or they're volunteering on behalf of an organisation to carry out those activities. So there has to be a third party involved to determine someone's suitability to be in regulated activity. And if it is an activity that's carried out as part of personal arrangements, then there's no one there to make that suitability decision, and therefore there is no eligibility for the enhanced, or for any for that enhanced level of check or higher. And obviously the same goes for children. Any activities that are carried out as part of a personal arrangement would not be considered to be regulated activity. The next example we have there is assistance with the conduct of an adult's affairs. So this would be regulated activity. So this refers to those individuals who've been given power of attorney over another adult, or people who have been appointed as a deputy for an adult, either under mental health orders or by the court of protection. Those adults would be in regulated activity. And the final example we have is conveying an adult, and this means transporting an adult or moving them around. So it's not specific to a vehicle, so it could mean helping to transport an adult around in a wheelchair, for example, like a hospital porter. But conveying an adult is regulated activity with adults, and it has to be for health, personal or social care reasons, again, due to the adult's age or disability. So carrying out any of these activities once would mean that the individual is in regulated activity with adults. And again, for regulated activity, it's important to remember that anyone who is responsible for the day-to-day management of someone in regulated activity is also in regulated activity themselves, and they would also be eligible for the same level of DBS check. And obviously in this case, when we're talking about these activities here, that would be enhanced DBS with an adult supervised list check. So I hope that's okay. Thinking about work with adults, which is not regulated activity. So this is work that would mean that the person carrying out the work is not eligible for enhanced DBS with an adult supervised list check, but they may still be eligible for enhanced DBS check on its own. There are rules that are set out in legislation, and we have produced an adult workforce guide to help organisations determine what an individual's eligibility is when they are in work with adults, when it's not considered to be regulated activity. So the adult workforce guides are available on our DBS website, and they do provide a lot of information about the different variables that would make somebody eligible when it's considered work with adults. And I have got a link to that as well, to those workforce guides a little further on in the presentation. So there are 3 steps that you have to consider for this level of eligibility, to give you a couple of examples of what we mean by work with adults. So for this level of DBS check, the first thing to think about is the adult who's receiving the activity. The adult has to be over 18 years of age, and also receiving what is known as a listed health or social care service, or receiving what is known as a listed activity. And these are what both set out in legislation. So to give you an example of the types of health and social care services, like what we mean by that is living in residential accommodation for care or nursing, living in sheltered housing, being provided with care or assistance because of the individual's age, illness or disability, and that could be in their own home or the place where they live. And anyone who's detained in prison or being detained in a remand centre or a removal centre as well. So if somebody is receiving one of these activities, basically, this is what we would class as receiving a listed health or social care service. And then, so step 2 then is about having a look at what the employee is going to be providing to those adults that are in step 1, which is the bit we just spoke about that. So the employee has to be either providing training, teaching or instruction to the adults in step 1, or providing them with assistance, guidance or advice. It could also include caring for adults or supervising adults, or providing them with any form of treatment or therapy. It could also include moderating a public interactive electronic communication service, for example, like a panic button. And it includes work that is carried out in a care home. And also includes driving adults that we spoke of, adults under contractual arrangements, perhaps for like medical appointments and treatments. So if step 1 and step 2 are met, so the individual is receiving health or social care services, and for example, and they are living in sheltered housing, and somebody is providing training or teaching to them, for example, in the form of a yoga teacher, for example, then the final step to look at is whether the activities are being provided often enough. So for this level of check, often enough, again, is more than 3 days in a 30-day period, once a week on an ongoing basis, or overnight between 2 AM and 6 AM with the opportunity for contact with the adults in step 1. So if all 3 of those steps are met, then the individual employee would be in work with adults, and it would not be regulated activity, but they would be eligible for the enhanced DBS check, and that's without the adults barred list check. So it's just the enhanced DBS check. So for example, as we said, a yoga instructor who is providing a yoga class once a week to the residents of sheltered housing accommodation, and they're providing it once a week, and therefore they'll meet the period requirements, and obviously includes instructing and teaching those residents about yoga, they would probably be eligible for just the enhanced DBS check. I hope that's all okay there. Other roles that are considered to be work with adults that would make someone eligible for enhanced DBS check, again, are trustees of adults charities that are eligible for that level of check. Again, if they are providing services wholly, mainly for adults who receive health and social care services, then they would be considered to be eligible for the enhanced DBS check. Specific positions in England and Wales, such as inspectors for the Care Quality Commission, they would also be eligible for an enhanced DBS check because they've been mentioned in legislation. And there are a lot more other roles as well that would be eligible for the enhanced DBS check because they've been mentioned in legislation. And finally, with regulated activity, anyone who's responsible for managing anyone who carries out work with adults activities is also considered work with adults. So they again would be eligible for the same level of DBS check. So I hope that's okay. So I did have a couple of examples here, and if people did want to get involved, they're more than welcome to. I'm not going to force anybody, but if anyone did want to get involved, they can do. So just a few, is this regulated activity or not? So a charity helpline is set up wholly or mainly for children and provides advice and guidance to children on their emotional, physical and educational well-being. The helpline call handlers provide this advice and guidance once a week. Does anyone have any thoughts on whether this will be regulated activity or not? Feel free to shout out if you'd like to.
So is it on, sorry, it's Lisa. So is it the children that are calling the helpline?
Yes.
Okay, so that'd be a regular activity, but I also get a bit confused of what is classed as direct contact with? Is direct contact with like face to face, or is this also direct contact with? Because yes, you can still have an influence, like an adult who wanted to could still then manipulate that child, couldn't they?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So
yeah,
in this case, they would definitely need a DBS check, wouldn't they?
Yeah, so they would need, this would be considered to be regulated activity because the service is set up wholly or mainly for children. So the charity helpline, because there is the opportunity for, although it's not direct contact and face-to-face, they are privy to the content that's being discussed on that helpline. They can speak to the children, and therefore, and obviously because they're providing this, helpline call handlers provide this advice and guidance once a week, so that crosses over the 3 days in a 30-day period threshold, in which case this would be considered regulated activity, and those helpline staff would be eligible for the enhanced DBS with the children's partners check as well. So absolutely, Lisa, that's absolutely correct. So I hope that's okay. I've got another one here as well. So we have Mohammed is a care worker who attends to Danny, who suffers from dementia. He visits Danny daily to prompt him to eat and take his medication. He also prompts him to wash regularly and supervising. So is this regulated activity? Yes or no? If anyone has any thoughts?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. So physically assisting or prompting because they're unable to make the decision to do these things themselves. If you're helping them, an adult, with eating, drinking, going to the toilet, then yes, it is regulated activity. And again, it only has to be done once. Obviously, we're working with an adult here, so it only has to occur once for it to be regulated activity, which is the case here. Okay, and the last two. So we've got Joshua has a running group for 11 to 15-year-olds. He trains the children twice a month on a Sunday morning in the local park. Anyone have any thoughts on whether that would be regulated activity?
Yes.
No. It's
oh, sorry.
Omar.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't think it's regulated because it's less than three times, right?
Absolutely, yes, you are correct, Omar. So yeah, so although he's running the group for children, again, this is where that the period conditions come in. So if it's less than 3 days in the 30-day period, it would not be regulated activity. So however, Joshua can, his employer can still carry out just the enhanced DBS check for him.
Sorry, I'm getting confused. So twice a month is more than the 30-day period, right? You said, what did you say about the 30?
3 days.
3 days.
3 days in the 30-day period. So if Joshua was running the group for 3 days in a 30-day period or more, then it's regulated activity. But because he's only doing it twice a month, so essentially just twice within the 30-day period, it's not regulated activity.
Okay.
And this is where things do get a little bit confusing, especially when you're looking at eligibility. And it's difficult because it's the difference between a day. So it's just about, and that's why we put it in here, just to get people just to thinking a bit about it. But certainly if his employer decides, actually, I think it'd be better to have, wanted to consider having the enhanced DBS check with the barred list, and obviously they would have to rethink about how often Joshua trains the children. But certainly just training the children twice a week would mean that Joshua would only be eligible for the enhanced DBS check. And last one is Leona is a parent who volunteers at her child's school, reading with the children, and she does this every Tuesday and Thursday morning. Would that be regulated activity?
Now she's supervised, right? Would she be supervised with a teacher in there? Does that make a difference?
Absolutely, it doesn't make a difference, Lisa. So yeah, so in this case, we're going to take it that she's not supervised. So she does it every Tuesday and Thursday morning. She's met the period condition of more than 3 days in the 30-day period. So she would be eligible for the enhanced DBS with the barred list check. However, as you pointed out, Lisa, if the volunteer manager of the school decides, actually, we have a supervisor who can watch Leona, then Leona may only be eligible for the enhanced check because the supervisor is there. So it just shows you, yeah, just the things that you need to think about sometimes in terms of understanding whether something's regulated activity or not. But hopefully that gave you a bit more of an idea. So just going to have a very quick look at barring now. And this is where the DBS prevent unsuitable people from working with vulnerable adults or children. So this involves the DBS making decisions about whether somebody should be barred from engaging in regulated activity with children, adults, or both. And that's in England, Wales, and in Northern Ireland. So we'll just have a little very quick look at that as well. So there are 3 ways that the DBS can get barring referrals. So we have discretionary referrals, which is when someone contacts the DBS because they have concerns that an individual may have harmed a child or a vulnerable adult, or they put a child or vulnerable adult at risk of harm. So these referrals can come from employers, agencies, keepers of registrars, supervisory authorities, anybody basically who has those concerns. We also get our referrals from the auto bar route as well, and that is where someone has been convicted of or cautioned for an automatic inclusion offence. So these are serious offences that are already set out in law. They usually include serious sexual and violent offences. And if somebody did commit one of those, it's already set out in law that the DBS would be required to bar that individual from working in regulated activity in the relevant workforce. And finally, the last route is disclosure information. So this is when information comes to light because an individual has applied for an enhanced check with one or both barred lists. Because the individual is looking to work in regulated activities, if the police national computer identifies particular information about the individual that is of a concern, that application will then automatically go to our barring team for consideration as to whether the individual should be considered to be barred, basically. For all 3 routes of referral, the individual who's been referred does have an opportunity for representation, which is where they can give their views and evidence through representatives. And representations are an important part of making fair, consistent, and thorough barring decisions. So let's look at, sorry, is that a question? No, okay. So just have to look at who has a legal duty to refer here. So some organisations have a legal duty to refer to the DBS, and this is all set out in legislation. So the legislation makes provision for, and that's a legislation that makes the provision for the disclosure checks of those persons who are seeking to work with children or vulnerable adults. And it also makes a provision for barring those who are considered to be unsuitable for such posts, and that's whether they're in paid employment or voluntary work. So if you're a regulated activity provider, an employer or a voluntary organisation who is responsible for the management and control of regulated activity and make arrangements for people to work in regulated activity, you have a legal duty to make a referral. If you are an employment agency, employment business or educational institution that makes arrangements with a person with a view to supplying that person to employers to undertake regulated activity. So for example, obviously a teaching agency, they also have a legal duty to make a referral. And there's two ways that a referral can be made. You can use a paper form or our online portal, and that allows you to submit your referral and complete it later if need be as well. And you can also upload electronic documents as well to support the referral. So that's the difference between our paper and our online referral ways. But either way, the key thing is always to make a referral if you felt that you were in a position where that needed to be done. And it's also important to know that even if the duty to refer isn't met, but you still feel that it's appropriate to make the referral to the DBS, then we are still legally required to consider the information and the referral. So just to bear in mind. But if there were ever any questions, then certainly you can always discuss that with me if need be as well. So now we looked at who has a legal duty to refer. Let's have a look at when a referral must be submitted to the DBS. So a referral should be made when two main conditions have been met. So condition one, somebody has caused harm to an individual or a vulnerable adult or a child within regulated activity, and the individual has been removed from that role and has removed from working regulated activity. So the removal could be a dismissal, a redeployment within the organisation, but not in regulated activity. The individual may then decide that that's the time they want to retire or resign, or they're made redundant. If any of these situations occur following an incident, then the legal duty to make a referral has been met because a situation occurred and that person then was removed from regulated activity. Either they removed themselves or they were removed by the organisation. The main point was that they were removed because of the situation and their behaviour or what they had done. So many employers feel that once an individual is no longer there, so for example, somebody then decides to resign all of a sudden, that the problem has been solved. But it's important to remember that the individual could then go on to work for another organisation or volunteer somewhere else. And you know, there's the potential for something similar happening or the same thing happening, and that's the concern there. So that's why it's important to always remember that even though the person is no longer with the organisation for whatever reason, a referral, the legal duty to make that referral has still been met if they were removed from regulated activity. So condition two, you must submit a referral again if you think the person has either engaged in relevant conduct, satisfied the harm test, or received a caution or conviction for being convicted or a relevant offence. So by relevant conduct, we mean conduct that endangers or is likely to endanger if repeated against or in relation to a child or an adult. So it's important to consider that it's not only that the person may have harmed, but their actions may have indirectly also caused harm, and they may have put somebody at risk. So if relevant conduct occurs, then the legal duty to refer has been met. And when we talk about satisfying the harm test, so by this we mean where there's no evidence of relevant conduct, so nothing officially or nothing has happened as such, but there is sufficient and compelling evidence to suggest risk of harm to a vulnerable group. So, for example, if someone has disclosed to a colleague that they're having thoughts of a sexual nature about children in their care, then this would be considered by the DBS as a risk of potential future harm. So even if they haven't acted upon it, the concern is still there. And that's what we mean by the harm test. And obviously, if somebody receives a caution or conviction, then obviously, again, the duty to refer has been met there as well. So it's just important. And at this point as well, I'd just like to mention that obviously, sometimes we do hear that people don't make a referral to the DBS because they feel that the police didn't take things any further and therefore why would the DBS? But just let you know, the burden of proof to be met by the prosecution of evidence on the courts and the police is beyond reasonable doubt, whereas the standard of proof used by the DBS is a civil stance approved. It's called, and it's the balance of probabilities. So it means that more likely than not, something has occurred. So our threshold is different to the police and the courts. And obviously, you know, where there is a concern, you know, and if there has been a situation and the person's been removed, then, you know, there is the duty to refer there, and that should be remembered and seriously considered as well. So I hope that's okay there. So in terms of a referral, what does a good quality referral look like? So obviously it's vital that you and your organisation understand when you should refer to the DBS, in terms of obviously recognising the instances where a referral is appropriate, and also knowing when you have sufficient evidence and information to make the referral is also very important. So make sure that your referral is timely. So balancing the need for a swift response, but with the need for sufficient documentary or supporting evidence is key as well. So it's obviously, you need to make sure that you're making a referral when you have enough information to give us, but obviously considering the risk that still exists while the process is progressing as well, is something to think about as well. Make sure the referral is accurate and fully completed, recognizing any gaps if they're present. Making sure it's chronological, so detail a sequence of events from the initial notification to the final outcome, and provide all relevant information to facilitate the DBS decision-making process. So that could include details of the victim or the potential victim, what harm was caused. These are important factors. The details should include the victim's age and why they're viewed as vulnerable. Perhaps they're a child or they're an adult receiving care. Being explicit when describing what's happened and providing as much information as you can, including the type of harm caused as well. So all that information can help our barring caseworkers to be able to understand what exactly has happened and be able to use that information to make that correct judgment. Provide accurate data training and supervision records, and any details of any internal or external investigations or disciplinary processes. So that could include interviews, police interventions, multi-agency meetings. So, and obviously it's also important to think about the recruitment and any additional information from an employment kind of view, any previous misconduct or complaints. This is all information that would be valuable to our barring caseworkers to understand and the situation as fully as possible. If you don't have access to certain information, then, you know, tell us who does have it and we can ask them. Because if you don't tell us, we won't know that information exists. So that's another key thing to also think about as well. And obviously a barring referral with as much detail and information as possible is only going to help our caseworkers to decide whether that referred individual should be barred from working in regulated activity or not. Obviously barring isn't something we take lightly. You know, we make sure that we have all the information that we can do, it's an important decision to make. So whatever information you can give us when that referral is being made is only going to help our barring caseworkers. And we do have a referral leaflet as well with the barring process in a bit more details, and that can be found on our website, and I have links to that as well. So and obviously if you ever have any doubts, you can also contact me as well. So we've looked at how to refer when legal duties met. Just to have a quick look at what the impact is if somebody is placed on one or both barred lists. So if an individual is placed on the children's barred list, that means they're not allowed to engage in regulated activity with children in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. If an individual is placed on the adults barred list, that means they're not allowed to engage in regulated activities with vulnerable adults in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. The bars for both children and adults work also applies to regulated work in Scotland as well. It's a criminal offence to work, seek work or offer to work in regulated activity if you are on the barred list, on the relevant barred list. And it's also a criminal offence for a person to permit an individual that they know or have reason to believe is barred from regulated activity to engage in regulated activity. And the maximum penalty for this is 5 years imprisonment or a fine. So it is a very serious offence if somebody does apply for work in regulated activity if they are on the barred list, and same for the employer for them to recruit them as well. So there are some serious repercussions for that. So as a final thought, if something occurs and if you don't make the referral to the DBS, who will? If you don't make the referral to the DBS, how will we know? And if you don't make the referral to the DBS, the person may go on to cause further harm to vulnerable adults or children. So I'm just going to mention that because I think sometimes a situation may occur, and because of all the different agencies that are involved, sometimes an organisation may feel that, okay, well, if social services are involved, they may be making the referral to the DBS, or the police will make the referral to the DBS. And then sometimes, unfortunately, no one makes the referral to the DBS, and in which case that individual can then go on and will get recruited elsewhere. Because as we said, if you don't make the referral to the DBS, how will we know? So even if other organisations have made the referral, you know, it's probably better that we get it from wherever we can, and as many if it is a duplication of a referral, then at least it's better to have that than have nobody at all. And just to let you know, if you do make a referral to the DBS, we will consider all the evidence when deciding whether the person should be barred, and we would only bar them from working with vulnerable groups if it's the appropriate and proportionate thing to do. So it is something we do take seriously, and we make sure that all the information is used to make a fair judgment. So I've got a few myth-busting exercises here quickly. So these are kind of like typical myths that come our way sometimes, and I just thought I'd share a few of them with you just to see if anyone has any thoughts. So does anyone have any thoughts about whether the DBS check is not a legal requirement?
It is a legal requirement.
Yeah, so it's true. A DBS check is not a legal requirement. So the DBS cannot mandate which checks are required for certain positions or job roles, and there's no legal requirement for the DBS to apply for a check. However, there are certain things that have to be considered, because as an employer, you have to consider whether there are any regulatory requirements for DBS checks to be carried out for certain positions. So for example, as we mentioned, like Ofsted and the CQC may state that a requirement for enhanced DBS checks are applied for if a person is in regulated activity. And it's also important that if you're employing someone to work in regulated activity with children or adults, there could be potential legal repercussions for employing somebody who is legally barred from working with children or adults, where you have a reasonable expectation to know whether that person is barred. So for those individuals in regulated activity, it's best practice to apply for enhanced DBS check with the check of the children's or the adults barred list as well. So although it's not technically a legal requirement, there are some roles there that will require a DBS check to be carried out. So it's a bit of a trick on there in a sense. So my employer can't accept my DBS certificate as it's from a previous employer. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Do they need to be site specific?
It's like, yeah, you're on the right lines there. So yeah. So DBS certificates are specific to the individual, but not to the employer. So, and in most cases, so as long as the workforce is the same and that level of DBS check is the same as well. So for example, if you've gone from a role where you needed an enhanced DBS with a children's bar list check and you move to another role that requires the same level of check, that is the discretion of the employer whether they want to use that DBS certificate. If it's obviously, you know, but then obviously there's things for the employer to bear in mind as well. So if it's a check from like 10 years, then obviously maybe not so great to use that one, but certainly, you know, there is no expiry date on a DBS certificate. So it can be used, taken to other employment or voluntary organisations, but obviously there's just things to bear in mind when that happens. But certainly if someone had a DBS certificate which from the child workforce and they then moved on to work with adults, then obviously that certificate would not be valid in that respect. And obviously, this is obviously also where the update service comes in handy as well. If the person was registered to the update service, the employer could then log on and just have a look to see if the certificate is still up to date and valid.
Kira, can I just clarify then?
Yep.
So if there's someone that has already got a DBS check valid and work with vulnerable children and adults, then if they come and, for instance, work in my place then with predominantly children, because their existing DBS certificate encompasses that, that's sufficient. We don't have to then go and get another one.
No. So if it was for the same workforce, so yeah, if they had the DBS certificate was for both children and adults, and obviously now they're going over to work with children, if it was still of that same enhanced level, the job that they were going to go into required that level of check, so, and obviously it was the same workforce, yes, you could still accept that certificate. So any things that you may want to bear in mind though is how long ago that certificate was issued. So obviously it was a very, very long time ago. That might be something that you may want to relook at. And obviously if they are on the update service, then you obviously have that and you can just log in and check their details. But certainly a DBS certificate doesn't have an expiry date, and it is at the discretion of the employer, as long as the workforce and the level of DBS check is still the same.
Okay. You know, you said expiry date, but I have to have mine every 3 years.
That would be down to your organization.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and each organization is different. So more than often, I've heard 3 years seems to be the magic number across a lot of organizations. So yeah, that will be a requirement by your organization.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Thank you.
No worries. Another myth buster we have here: an individual could have police information on their certificate even if they've never had a conviction for an offence. This is actually, if anyone has any thoughts on this.
And they didn't have a conviction?
Yeah, so an individual could have police information on their certificate even if they've never had a conviction for the offence.
I don't think.
False?
No, I think that's myth. To me, sorry.
Oh.
Yeah, is
You
it?
think it's true?
No, it's not true.
Oh, okay.
Is it?
True. It's
It
okay.
is
No,
true.
it is actually true, and this is it. This
All
is where
right.
people have this is why they're mythbusters. So for enhanced DBS checks, the police will provide any information relating to any spent or unspent convictions, cautions, reprimands, or warnings that are not filtered off the certificate. But the enhanced DBS check will obviously provide relevant police intelligence too. So even though they may have never had a conviction for it, if there is information that the police have access to, that he wasn't, or they were not convicted, however they were involved in this, that information they could still disclose that information.
All right, I understand.
Yeah, so no,
Yeah.
that's okay.
Yeah.
Kiran, I have one question. When you were mentioning the individual who could have, whether the employee can accept my DBS certificate, is there a procedure where when I get my DBS check done, I can load it on a particular site, a government site, and then ask my new employer to verify it from there? Is there some facility like that?
So that's the update service?
Yeah,
so within 28 days of receiving your standard or enhanced DBS certificate, you can register it with our DBS update service, and that's £13 a year. So that means that if you then change jobs, you could take that certificate to your new employer, and along with your login details, and as long as you consent, the employer can then log on and have a look to see whether that certificate is still valid and up to date. Obviously, it would have to be for a role that is obviously, as I mentioned to Lisa, of the same workforce, and the same level of check would be required for this new role that you're going into. So, for example, you couldn't take your enhanced DBS check and move to a job with a basic.
So do you update that then after a year?
Yes. So the update service is updated, so that's checked against the Police National Computer and the Barred List weekly, and checked against police intelligence every 9 months. So yeah, as long as your employer has your consent, then they can technically check as often as they need to, really.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that.
No problem.
Kiran, sorry, it's Parul here. Hi, my love.
Hi.
I'm a bit confused. I've realised that I've been getting my DBS wrong for so many years. So thank you so much for this.
Okay.
So if I have an enhanced DBS, I can't then go to employment with a basic and use it as a basic DBS. I have to then get a basic one. Is that what you said?
Yeah. So if you got your enhanced check and you wanted to move to another employer, as long as you were moving into a role that also required an enhanced check, that's absolutely fine. But if you were moving to a role where you only required a basic check, your employer shouldn't be they shouldn't be able to access the particular level of information that is disclosed on an enhanced check. Does that make sense?
Okay, I see. Got it.
Yeah, it's all about the information that's disclosed. So
got it. Yeah.
If you've got, obviously, as you know, like the enhanced check will detail a lot more information than an employer for a basic check would ever require. So it comes down to your rights and your data protection rights, which is why it is the way it is, basically.
Got it. So I've been updating my DBS for 12 years, and for the same thing. So I've just been giving money to the government, really, haven't I?
Right, okay. I mean, we can certainly pick that up afterwards, probably, if you wanted to.
No, this is just very, I'm glad I'm here.
Oh, good, I'm glad, yeah. So I'll just do one very quick one, and then we'll, because I'm just conscious of time. There's been a concern with an employee which I reported to the police, therefore a DBS referral isn't needed. Again, as I mentioned earlier as well, obviously, you know, what tends to happen is that a lot of agencies feel that the other agency is going to make the referral. So social services think that health will make it, and health think that the police will make it. Essentially, no one makes the referral, and then the DBS is never informed. So yes, if there is a concern with an employee, even though you've reported it to the police, you should absolutely still make that referral to the DBS, if you have, if the legal duty to refer has been met. So there you go. So those were that. I'm just going to very quickly whiz through the very last bit. So this is all kind of very, this is just the outreach service, which is obviously the service that I provide. So my role essentially is to work closely with yourselves and your prospective organisations, and the wonderful Ealing and Hounslow CVS as well, and all recruiting and safeguarding organisations within the Greater London region. I'm a point of contact for anything to do with the DBS, and as I've done here today, delivered this workshop, you know, that's something that if within your organisations, within your teams, you felt actually that information, there's a few of us as a team and we would like that information, then I could certainly put something together again and come and deliver that directly to yourselves as well. But and also the other thing I can also do is if you have any policies or guidances relating to the DBS, I'd be happy to have a look at them as well. So I mean, anything to do with the DBS, anything where you feel actually, Kiran, it'd be good to have a chat, please do reach out, and you know, I'll be more than happy to help and get involved. So hopefully after all of that, we've been able to have a look obviously at the benefits of the DBS and yourself working together. We've looked at the different levels of DBS checks and when an employee is eligible for a particular level of check. We had a look at regulated activity and the update service and how that can help employers keep on top and on track of an individual's DBS certificate and make sure that there's valid and correct. We also looked a little bit about barring as well. So hopefully that's given you a good idea of how DBS can help with your safer recruitment practices and what role it can play within those as well. I have some links as well that I will send this to Noika, and then hopefully she'll be able to disseminate to you all. So you've got some of the links there that will be able to further help and support some of the information that we discussed today. And I'll also have my contact details there as well as other contact details for our key departments within our organisation in case you ever need to contact them. But certainly my email address is right there at the top as well. So you're more than welcome to contact me if you have any other concerns. And that's me there. So I have an evaluation form as well. It'd be great if you could complete that for me. And obviously, you know, your feedback is very important and helps me to adapt and my own workshop if need be as well. And obviously, you know, it's about constructive development there as well. So I'd really appreciate it if you could complete that. And then that's it from me basically. So I'm going to quickly stop sharing, and if anybody has anything they'd like to mention, that'd be great. Any questions, I'd be happy to.
Kiran, I'm sorry, we also have a feedback form that I've added on to the link.
Okay.
So would yours be different? Then you can add yours too, but we would also like you to give us some feedback on the session today and how you know, Kiran has, you know, if you need any further support and how we could track that for you.
Yeah, no, I'll be happy to pass that around. So this will link will be within the presentation anyway, so I'm happy to do that. So thank you. Lisa, you had a question?
Yeah, sorry. So this is just on behalf of my committee, but I think I know the answer. So it's only if people, we're a swimming club, we have children and young people, but there are people who do not have an active role with children face to face, i.e. committee members and people, for instance, doing our social media. So they don't have direct contact with the young people and children. So that means they don't need a DBS, do they?
They can still get a basic DBS check done though.
Basic,
okay. Yeah. So as I mentioned, obviously although there is not a legal requirement for a DBS check, obviously, and we're not talking about the roles in regulated activity here, a lot of organisations will still carry out a basic DBS check as good practice, just so that they're protected, but also the person they're also employing is also protected as well. So, you know, but a basic check where if you can't access any of the other checks, you can always access the basic.
Okay, thank you.
But if there is anything that anyone wants to separately talk to me about, you know, by all means, do drop me an email and we can arrange a time and we can go over some of the roles and have a look at which ones are eligible for which level of DBS check. I'll be more than happy to do so.
I've also added Kiran's contact details and email
Thank
ID
you.
in the chat.
That'd be great. Thank you. Does anybody have any other questions?
I think it's been a brilliant session and with a lot of information, and I'm sure a wealth of information here. I didn't know so much existed. I've done my DBS a couple of times and didn't know all of this was involved, but that's lovely. Thank you for sharing this with us today. Anyone else has any questions for Kiran today?
Hi,
We're very lucky to have her, actually. It's very difficult to get hold of a DBS person on and you know, to have all this done said. I think Anab, you want to ask something?
Yeah, hi, how are you? Actually, I wanted to ask anything because I'm volunteer and just I think it's someone invited me and I come second time. But I don't have any organization or anything, but I just work Ealing Council as a volunteer. So you know, I've just kind of got lost because no one has explained it. And I think you guys, you work at the council or somewhere, but I'm just a volunteer, so I just include it. Because I received the email from you, I think. Someone sent the email.
Was that from the DBS?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so maybe that would be through, so whoever you're volunteering, their recruitment manager, they would have probably processed a check for you.
Yeah, I do. I work with the children. I got my one actually. I renew every 3 years. So I do have. So I work, you know, they're like especially children actually in school. So I have my own voice, yeah.
Right, okay, right, yeah. So you'll have you'll be, probably have the
yeah. Well, great to have you guys. Thank you so much. I learned so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Don't forget to click the link that I put in the chat to give us your feedback, because your feedback will help us make this session even more better. We can tailor the session and the training and you know, support you even better.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. Thanks for you.
Sharanjit, your hand is up there. Hello, Sharanjit. Just trying to get to her system. Sharanjit, do you have a question for Kiran? Okay, I think there's some problem with the internet.
Not to worry. I mean, yeah, I'll certainly send over my email details anyway and the evaluation link. So if you could share that, Noika, that'd be really, really great.
I'll do that. I will send your feedback link too, so you'll be able to get that feedback. I think Sharanjit is trying to come in just a second.
Okay, no worries.
Before that, can I ask a question, if you don't mind?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Hi, Emma.
I was gonna ask you. I think mine was it was done in Heathrow Airport sometimes back, the enhancement. So then one time, I think a couple of years ago, and I think there was another job I was doing. It's been done. It's expired. Is there any way I can log in, or do I have to apply for a new one? I haven't applied it yet.
Okay, so that would be your employer. So if it's, I mean, of a basic check, obviously you can do yourself. If you wanted to, you could go on the government website and submit your own basic DBS check application. But if it was anything more than that, the standard enhanced or enhanced with barred list check, you need an employer or somebody who's going to make what we call a suitability decision to process that for you. So and obviously that will depend, as we spoke about, on the role and the activity that you're doing. So if it's something that you currently are looking into, by all means you can do your own basic check, but anything more than that, you'd have to talk to your employer.
No worries. No worries. Thanks.
Okay, can anybody hear me now?
Yes, we can, Sharanjit.
Oh, that's good. Sorry, I had to come out to the Zoom meeting and then join in again because I don't know, some problem. Anybody call me, then I can't go back to the Zoom talk again. Nobody can hear me. Maybe something to do with a technical problem or something. Kiran, thank you very much because your information is really important for us as organizations because it helps us to understand the importance of the DBS. Although when I'm a Sharanjit from Sunshine of Hounslow, when I take any volunteers to work with us, I always take their DBS documents. I also work with the other organization and then work with the mothers and children as well. And then they check my DBS. So I don't have to pay for my DBS. So basically it also helps both ways. So basically they do have my DBS done so that I can use it everywhere I need to. So
Okay.
it's a great help. But I think for anybody's or any organization safety and security, it's very important that to have a DBS. But I would really request you to come at least once or twice a year to update us with all these, mm, update information or anything changes. At least how would we know if you don't come?
Yeah.
So
No,
you are very important for us.
oh, no, I'd be more than happy to, Sharanjit. So if Noika and Ealing Hounslow CVS will have me, I'd be more than happy to come along again. So, and certainly if we have any updates or if anything changes in terms of legislation or in terms of the filtering rules or anything at all, I'll certainly let Noika and Parul know anyway, and then we can always discuss how to disseminate that information further. So that's no problem.
Yeah, it's important to, bring back the update information at least once a year, twice a year is important. I'll request Noika to get you back again at some point so
Thank
we
you.
can. No, we can remind with the new, be reminded with the new information if there is any.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No
thank you.
problem.
Thank you.
Be happy to have Kiran here with us again. It has been a very, very detailed session today. Thank you for that, Kiran.
No problem. Thank you so much for having me. And if there is anything, by all means, feel free to contact me directly. I'll be happy to anyone. That's great.
For those who haven't already given us your feedback, don't forget to click that so we can bring more informative sessions to you. And thank you so much for coming and joining us today, and have a good evening.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
It's nice for Noika to sit there and look so pretty, isn't it?
You do.
I know.
You're
Especially when Kiran is doing all the talking.
you always look glamorous.
Normally Noika do all the talking today.
When I open my mouth, I sound like a frog.
No,
No.
My house voice.
Hi, everyone.
well, it's nice to let the other people do the job as well, and sometimes nice for Noika to sit and look pretty, innit?
Did it very well.
Thank you guys
Brilliant,
for
lovely
joining us
session,
today.
very informative, very good, very good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Noika. I hope that was okay.
Thank you, Kiran. Thank you. I was just waiting for the last one to leave before I can politely end the call. Thank you. It has been an amazing session. In fact, Deborah Adams has also put in a comment saying, thank you for today's session, most interesting.
Oh, brilliant.
So I will share the feedback that comes to me. I didn't know you had a feedback form, which is why I quickly created one so I can put it on there.
Okay, don't worry. Yeah, that's fine, don't worry. Yeah, I mean, we'll both be using it for different things, so it's not a problem at all. Yeah, that's fine. So yeah, just yeah, be great.
I have got most of the things covered in terms of contact details and what they felt about the session, what they knew, how much they knew and how much they would benefit and stuff like that.
Oh, okay.
So I'll pass those on to you.
Brilliant. That'd be great. Yes, that'd be really helpful as well. Thank you so much.
Take care. Have a good
afternoon. Yeah.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.